our neurons all the way out to our action potentials. So you should now understand how the neurons are firing. What we're going to be doing today is to elaborate more on the central nervous system. As we mentioned, the central nervous system is filled with interneurons. And those interneurons are all part of the integrative system that is doing all the thinking, decision-making, all the memory, perception. It's receiving sensory information from our senses, and it's going to be sending motor outputs to either through the autonomic pathways or through the somatic pathways. So we're going to start learning towards the end of today. We'll learn about the spine and the efferent and afferent pathways that travel through. But right now I just want to kind of talk more about really just the brain before we move into the spinal cord. So when we talked on Tuesday, we talked specifically just about the brain structure. So that isn't very conceptual. It's really just going through and talking about the different features, different areas of the brain, and particularly the functions that they typically exhibit. And one of the things the key things that we talked about, we looked at cerebral lateralization, in that areas of the brain have, whether you're looking at the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere, have regional specialization in terms of its function. So if you look at the left hemisphere, this is more related to analytics. You look at calculations, you look at speech and writing, as opposed to the right side, which is more visual spatial, meaning looking at spatial concepts, being able to map things in your head. So people that are really good at looking at maps, are not even really looking at maps, people that drive places, and they just generally know where to go because they can see it in their head, those are very right-brain people. Okay? When you look at certain damages to certain areas, and I know somebody brought up mentioned earlier, that's areas of stroke. Depending on where the areas of the stroke can really affect, you can tell will affect that particular area. So any damages to the left side of the brain, more towards like the temporal lobe, frontal lobe area, may have speech problems, may have difficulty speaking afterwards due to the damage in that particular area. And then any areas to the right hemisphere may start having difficulty trying to find their way around. So may have a tendency to get lost because they've lost that ability to map things out. And so we looked at our split brain experiments, and I'm going to skip into the areas that we talked about. We looked at the central sulcus, which splits the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, and we looked at two particular areas. The front area of the central sulcus, which is the primary motor cortex, is the area that's responsible for motor. Okay, so this is where you can control area, where we're going to see what we're going to know later on as upper motor neurons. These are the neurons that are going to be sent over to the spinal cord segments that will control that particular area of the brain. And I'll talk more about that. I just want to do a quick recap. Now, the parietal lobe, the most frontal part of the parietal lobe, is called the somatosensory cortex. So this whole band right here is the one that we're talking about. This area of the parietal lobe is responsible for somatosensory information. That's information that's sent in, sensory information sent in from that particular body part. So when we looked at the somatosensory motor homunculus, this was what I was talking about last time, was at the tail end of Tuesday's lecture, is that certain areas, when we look at the primary motor cortex, here you can see that split with the central sulcus. Right at the front is the primary motor cortex. Areas that require, specifically for motor, areas that require fine motor control. Lots of muscles in that area that require a lot of control, such as the face, the lips, the neck, well maybe not the neck, but mostly the face and the hands, represent more areas of that slice. Okay? As opposed to other areas where, yes, they may be bigger muscles, but it's pretty much the same gross movement. I mean, flexion of the knee, and that's really all it's doing. So those areas have a tendency to have a very small portion of the motor cortex. Same with the somatosensory, so areas that receive a lot more information, such as the lips, hands, and so forth, have a lot, represent a big area of that slice, because it receives a lot of information and sends that back. The areas that we talked about can send information back and forth from each other. So we'll talk about that when we look at our reflexes. So with that, I want to start to tie into what we're going to be looking at, we finished off with some of the other functions, the cerebral white matter. Remember, we talked about the gray matter being the neuron cell bodies on the outside, white matter being the myelinated axons on the inside of the brain. So now let's get into more some of the functions of the brain itself. And when looking at the brain, there's really no way aside from just going in and actually looking at it. We do have different clinical ways of visualizing the brain itself, the three of which you're probably already familiar with. And the first portion is called CT scan. This is typically something that is done. It's a quick X-ray, and what's typically done with a CT scan is are X-rays that are sent into the soft tissue, and these X-rays are absorbed based on the density of the tissue, whether we're looking at bone, if we're looking at muscle, or we're looking at fat, or even air pockets. Areas that are typically denser will absorb more of the X-rays, while areas that are fairly lighter, like areas of soft tissue, may not absorb as much X-rays. So therefore, when you get these X-rays going in, you can see the different densities of tissues, and you can tell if there's any particular masses or anything like that. That's usually the first thing they do. It's a fairly quick, easy scan. The next one is quite a different type of scan called the positron emission tomography. And basically what this comes down to are the use of contrast, radioactive isotopes. If you remember from our first lecture, we talked about contrast that's used. And this was our tagged fluorodeoxyglucose, FDG, which is a common contrast that's given in PET scans. And that is a tagged glucose molecule that will eventually make its way over to areas that are fairly active. And what they're looking for in a PET scan is to look for areas that have high metabolism. Okay? So how does that work specifically? Well, these isotopes that make their way out, they emit these radiation that comes off that contrast, specifically off that FDG, and it interacts with the electrons. So any cells that have high electron activity are going to get lit up, and then that is actually seen in the imaging. So think about where you would see electrons. Where would you see electrons in active cells? Think about that for a second. This is going to have to, you're going to have to go back to a prior lecture. Where did we see cells that were generating a lot of, I don't want to give it away, but highly metabolically active, meaning it's using a lot of glucose. And where do those electrons come from? Where do you see a lot of electron activity? I know you know the answer. You got to think about that.
Does that have to do with movement?
Well, think of electrons moving around a lot. I'll give you another clue. It's somewhere in the mitochondria.
Oh, ATP.
ATP, okay, you're getting there. But specifically, which area of the whole ATP cellular respiration bit?
In the
membrane.
Almost. It's in the name. Electron transport chain. So if you remember that was our first cellular respiration lecture. We had those enzymes. We had NADH and we had FADH2 that are donating those electrons, and they're moving from enzyme to enzyme in the electron transport chain. So these things are moving back and forth, and they're constantly generating ATP. So there's a lot of activity in the mitochondria. So as those electrons are moving around, contrast is sitting there hitting it with positrons. These are just basically gamma energy that are crashing with those electrons, and they're lighting up, and they can see areas of the brain that are active. So this is particularly useful if they're trying to do like a functional scan where they are looking at areas, or if they're looking at areas that are growing way too fast. Right? So things like cancer and so forth, or if they're looking at drugs, for instance, and they want to find if the drug is being effective in a certain area. And kind of taking that back with, I'll talk about that later. The next one is the MRI, so magnetic resonance imaging. So this is another scan where obviously no contrast is used in most cases. But what they would do is they use these huge magnets. Has anybody ever been in an MRI before? Okay, so MRI is just basically a small tube, and you've got these huge magnets that are moving around. And what they do, as these magnets move around, it creates the protons, the hydrogen ions. Obviously being used quite a bit in the mitochondria. You saw the chemiosmotic mechanism. Those protons move around quite a bit, and that creates areas, and that allows us to be able to visually see it. So you get these protons that are vibrating, and you can then therefore see the imaging that takes place. And that gives us a really good view because we can see from slice to slice, and we can actually see each of the physical features based on that. Right. So the next thing we can do, so that gives you imaging of the brain itself. Now we can go in and actually measure the electrical activity that takes place in the brain. And this is what we call the electroencephalograph. So if you remember, if you probably at some point have seen EKGs, so the electrocardiograph, these show electrical activity of the brain. And so this is kind of an exaggeration. Nobody really wears, for an EEG, nobody wears this many probes onto their head. But what we're doing is we're measuring the action potentials taking place in the brain. Where is it taking place? It's taking place in the cell bodies and dendrites. We're looking at, well, mostly in the axons. The action potentials that are taking place, we can measure those. And what we're looking for in an EEG are different waveforms, and I'll show you that in a little bit. Anytime you get the movement of these ions through the neurons, it's going to produce a little bit of a current. So we're looking at changes in those currents. And the purpose of this is that typically what we want to do is just measure the waveforms, which we'll look at on the next slide. But what's interesting about these brain patterns is if you were ever plugged into an EEG machine and you look at the waveforms that are produced out of here, they're going to sum up all the movements, all the electrical activity in the brain, and you'd probably venture to think that it was rhythmic, but that's actually not true. Ever looking at an EEG, you would see that we're actually, our waveforms are actually very abnormally regular, meaning it looks like, I'm just going to draw a bunch of scribbles. It just looks like this. You just get a bunch of random activity. And that's because there's a lot of like spontaneous activity that's happening in the brain, and there's really no rhyme or reason behind it. There's just so much firing going on. And that's just you being conscious, being awake, and receiving information, constantly receiving sensory information. So there's no one particular area that's going to exhibit more electrical activity than another. So let's take a look on the next slide on particular EEG patterns, so electroencephalograph. And we can measure different types of waveforms, 4 that I'm providing for you right here, that characterize the amount of electrical activity that's happening in the brain. And the one that we're all experiencing right now are beta waves. This is our first wave. And before I start to get into the waves, let me just kind of go over some of the real basics of wave patterns. And so what you probably may have remembered are wave patterns that look like this. And we know that the wavelength is the distance from one part of the cycle to the next. And you can see that this is constantly repeating. We get repeating 1, 2, 3 signals right there. And we have the wavelength, we have the amplitude, which is the height of the wave. And then what we can do in terms of measuring how many waveforms we get, we basically measure how many waveforms we get per second. Okay, so we get a lot of activity and you measure out, this is the length of a second. You get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cycles per second. And that also is referred to as hertz. There's also the same thing you've heard about radio signals. How many times do you see a wave, each repeating wave every second? So naturally, when you get higher frequencies, you would start to see something more like this. Higher amplitudes, you can see higher waveforms, smaller waveforms, smaller in amplitude, just like that to the right. So now that we have that down, let's take a look and see the patterns. So like I said, all of us are experiencing beta waves right now, which is basically us being awake, simply awake, and we're receiving information. You're seeing visual stimuli up on the PowerPoint, you're hearing my voice, you're thinking about things, so forth. Where do you see most of that energy coming from? Where do we see where it's mostly characterized? We see it in the frontal lobes and the precentral gyrus. If you were to take a look at where that activity happens, how much activity, it's about 13 to 25 cycles per second. And for the purpose of the test, I'm never going to really ask you about the number of cycles per second. I just want you guys to get the general gist of it. So these waveforms are small amplitude, right? Very small amplitude, and fast. So as we move down from beta to alpha to theta to delta, you'll see we're going to be going slower. So these are going to be slower cycles. So we're going from low amplitude, high frequency, down to low frequency, higher amplitude. So beta waves here, you can see what the waveforms look like. Very small amplitude, high frequency. These are typically things that you see with concentration, arousal, being conscious, being awake. The next thing to look at are alpha waves. And alpha waves are typically elicited when you're just relaxed. Close your eyes a little bit, relax, try to think about really nothing. And that's going to start to evoke alpha waves, where you start to see the waveforms start to slow down. And as those waveforms slow down, you'll see the amplitude start to raise. Okay? And that's because you get a lot less competing waveforms over here. Once you start to get the waves more uniform, you'll see that they start to go a little bit higher. And where do we typically see those? Parietal and occipital lobes. If you were to where you would measure alpha waves is somebody right before sleep. You actually get it during meditation. And you also get it from watching TV. So if you sit there and you kind of just zone out on the TV and you don't really think about anything at all, measure it, you'll see a lot of alpha waves happening. The next one are theta waves. And theta waves, if you were to see where those take place, really in the back of the head, in the temporal region. Theta waves, again, slower but higher amplitude. And with these theta waves, they are fairly significant, and you would see that this is typically something that happens during sleep. It actually happens during REM sleep, which we'll be talking about, rapid eye movement. There's a lot of theory behind what's happening with our theta waves in regards to memory, emotions, how we process information, and things that happen during sleep. And again, I'll go more into what happens in REM sleep at a later phase. And then the last one are delta waves. And here, delta waves, you can clearly see really high amplitude and very slow waves. Here you can see about one cycle, about one to two cycles per minute. And you'll notice with delta, this is typically where you see very deep sleep. So once somebody hits that very first stage of really deep sleep, you see these very prominent, uniform waves. And what's interesting about the delta waves is it does mimic what it looks like if you're in a very deep stage of sleep. And like a good example would be coma. So in a case where the brain is no longer functioning as well, you start to see very uniform waves. So if you were to do an EEG on somebody and you saw these very high amplitude slow patterns, that really could signify brain death at that point in time. You don't see beta waves, you don't see alpha waves of any kind. It's just very rhythmic, slow activity. That means the neurons are just firing like this. And that's all that's happening. You don't get a lot of this sort of chaotic activity. Now, those are the four that I'm giving you. The other ones that I want to talk about are just sort of other fun topics. So they do have, one of the things that they were looking at are also called gamma waves. And gamma waves, if beta waves are about 13 to 25 cycles per second, we have gamma waves. And these gamma waves are really fast patterns like this. I mean, I'm talking about really, really low amplitude, high frequency. And where they found these, what's really interesting about this is they found that we get a lot of firing in experiments where they wanted to test what's called the unity of consciousness. And we actually don't have any units. Same one as that, or Tuesday. And what they did was they had monkeys, and they measured these waveforms in monkeys back in 1968, where they put them into basically, I don't know if it was a cage or a room or something like that, and all the monkeys were just literally just sitting there. And they all noticed that they were all together, and what they noticed about that is that they all started to exhibit. When they put the monkeys together, they found these fast gamma waves that were happening. And they thought, why is it only when these monkeys were together that they started experiencing them? And so they started to speculate that it had something to do with an awareness of your consciousness. This is like they speculated it was sort of like that free will, the control to, the ability to control whatever is in front of you, that you're interacting with the environment, that you actually have a place in the world, and that you're not just there just to feed and to reproduce and so forth, that you actually have these interactions. And they did the same thing with Tibetan monks. When they all have, when they all start meditating together, they all will just kind of sit there together, and they eventually will find they exhibited the same gamma waves. So that must mean something, that there is something to do with these particular waves. Another thing that they did back in Frankfurt University is to take those same gamma waves. They can basically make those same electrical waveforms, and they place them onto their head, and they, it wasn't really more of a shock, but they're basically forcing the electrical activity onto people that were sleeping. And they put it right on the frontal lobes, and what they experienced, what people experienced when they woke up, they said, I felt awake during that entire time. So they were actually asleep. They knew they were asleep. They had them all hooked up. They can tell they were asleep. But what they experienced was something called lucid dreaming. Has anybody ever heard of lucid dreaming? So lucid dreaming is a form of dreaming. And if you're ever interested in it, just read about it, look up some YouTube videos. It's the ability to sleep, to dream, and then to control your dreams. So you're literally just being able to, it's like being in an interactive movie where you're like, I want this to happen, I want this to happen, I don't like where this is happening, I'm just gonna move away from things. And there's a lot of interesting stuff. If you ever even look up some of the audio, they have things that will try and elicit lucid dreaming, and what they're playing back is a very high frequency sound, and they'll take you through different stages of sleep to elicit those waveforms. Really crazy stuff. I remember playing around with it. I got freaked out. I'm like, oh, I don't know about this, because I really did feel like I slept. Like when I woke up, I was like, I need to go back to sleep. I need regular sleep. This was too much. I don't really remember what happened, but nonetheless, some scary stuff. Maybe something that my fragile mind couldn't handle. So with that, those were gamma waves. Another thing that they also looked at were another type of wave that's very similar to beta waves. But where did they find these beta? They're called mu waves, MU. These mu waves they found to be specifically in the primary motor cortex. Again, the most posterior portion of the frontal lobe, the area that corresponds to motor. And they measured a lot of these mu waves, and it all corresponded to motion. So let me take you back to an example that I mentioned earlier, tying in this example that I had in college. They had me, if you remember my story from early, our second lecture, I remember I mentioned I was inside a PET scan, and they had a video, and they made me watch this video of someone putting the coffee cup back, picking it up, putting it back down. And what they were looking for specifically, and they injected me with contrast, they wanted to find an area of the brain that corresponded to the movement of the arm and the hand, but specifically with the left hand. And every time I kept thinking about it, it would start to get lit up in this scan. So they do the PET scan. They also did a functional MRI where they did inject me with contrast to find that particular area that corresponds to the action of picking something up. And they wanted me to not focus on anything at all. So that way they're able to find, okay, here's a primary motor cortex. This is the area that corresponds to the hand. They've been able to identify that area because that area is metabolically active. Marlon is thinking about this over and over and over again. This must be the area. So what they wanted to do to me next was then inject me with this, they had that helmet on, they had this probe, and they wanted to shock that area. That's the part I didn't do. But what's interesting about these mu waves, if they measured it, if they were able to measure mu waves, they noticed that that area of the brain when I'm not thinking about, well, maybe not me in this case, but in the studies that they've done, if they measure those mu waves happen all the time, but the second you start thinking about emotion, or when you start experiencing that emotion, it turns the mu wave off. So in other words, mu waves are turned off when you think or do something with your muscles. Okay? And when they're able to do that, and they have that area mapped of the primary motor cortex, they figured, well, if we can receive the signal from the brain, does it mean that that's what's used to control that particular body part? So with that, what they wanted to do is receive those messages, and if they could receive those messages from the brain, could that directly signal something related to motion? So could they predict someone's motion by just reading the brain waves taking place? And so this gives rise to the whole mind-machine interface. So to give you an idea of what they're trying to do, is if they read those mu signals from the brain, from the primary motor cortex, and they can send that over to something else, not connected physically to me, send those same signals over to the motor neurons that are responsible for moving that motion, could they get me to sort of think about emotion and get some other external thing to mimic that motion? So this ventures into the whole, what's called MMI, mind-machine interface. It's the ability to receive signals from the motor cortex, the areas that they want to read, and detect that movement pattern and be able to use that on something external. So this gives a lot of rise into telepathy, the ability to control things with your mind, specifically with motion. And that might be a little far-fetched. I know we're sticking strictly with physiology, not trying to venture off into far away from reality. But the reality is, there's a lot of interest in this. Okay? A lot of military interest in our ability to control things with our mind. Things with space exploration. If we can start to control robots just through the virtue of thinking about things, being able to navigate, and so forth. So they've done a lot of experiments of rat to rat. Duke University was able to take a rat and elicit a tail wagging in one rat, and they had it plugged into a bunch of EEGs. And they transmitted that signal over to another rat where they severed the spine. And they severed the spine obviously from the brain to the tail, and they wanted to see if rat number one could do the tail wagging, and connected it to the muscles of another tail, could that elicit the tail wagging on another? And they found they were able to do that. So naturally, they thought, okay, well, let me try something else. Let's try humans and rats. So they had a guy watch a TV screen, and I think I have a video for that. Yeah. Let me just show you the video. How about that? So this guy is going to be staring at a machine, and what they're going to be doing is every time he sees a flinch, they want to see, can we get this same rat who has its spine severed, could they also get this tail to wag as well? So here you can see him watching. He's literally just watching the signal. He's got his EEG on. And every time we're looking at here you can see the tail starting to move. And every time we reach this portion where there's a little spike, that causes movement in the tail. And that's all through him thinking about when that's taking place. I don't think it happens again, does it? But you get the idea. One more time at least, come on. There it is. So these are the things that we think, okay, maybe there must be some way to do it. Another thing they were able to do, so now they had that, and another thing they wanted to do was also human to human. So they used a finger twitch. So they connected two people together, and this was over in Washington University, where they had these two people completely in different rooms, and this would send a signal. He was, I think, watching the same type of flashing sign or something like that, and whenever he got a signal, he had to think about the motion of twitching that finger. and it came across, and what they were trying to do is same type of experiment where they could cause a probe to see, will he receive that signal? Is there some matching? Would he know if they can sense that mu signal, would he know that he had twitched? And so they were, I don't remember the results of that, but it didn't seem like that cool of an experiment. What was a cool experiment was this. So here they take a monkey, okay? And what you notice about the monkey, they got the machinery up on here. They have the monkey's head resected, and they have the brain kind of exposed. And one of the things they wanted to do was find the primary motor cortex. And they have electrodes plugged into the primary motor cortex, and they have him connected to this machine. And this machine is an external arm. Obviously, the monkey can't really move its hands or anything like that, but it over time has to learn, and they do a lot of, keep in mind, they can't just plug you into a machine and all of a sudden you learn how to control this thing. This took a lot of time to learn the motions of moving things. So he learned eventually how to manipulate this arm all through his brain by itself. So by manipulating this machine, you'll be able to see how he's able to grab the treat itself. You see the wires back there connected, and of course they don't show you what's happening up there. So there's a lot of implications behind stuff like this. If plugged into a machine and reading these same mu waves, and those mu waves corresponding to muscle motion and movement, could we get people that actually lose the capacity, people that are paraplegic, people that are quadriplegics, could we potentially get them to be able to move external machines as well? And we'll see that on our next slide. Okay. So this lady, I'm going to skip a little bit of the video because they get into...
I always said, except for this walking thing,
it's 9 minutes. And I know we kind of want to just cut to the heart of this whole story. But she's a quadriplegic that injured herself during, she injured herself, I forget what type of injury or what accident happened. And she signs up for this experimental protocol. She has absolutely no control of her arms and legs. And so what they wanted to do with her is part of this experimental protocol. This is a research protocol where they would install these electrodes into the primary motor cortex. And keep in mind, there's nothing wrong with the motor cortex. That's still functioning. It's just the motor cortex that leads up to the extremities is severed. But she'll still think about it. She can still think about moving. So they want to get these probes to connect into the primary motor cortex to see if she can learn to manipulate this machine that's supposed to basically be the human hand. And so these machines have, and this goes into a little bit more of the technical side of the machine, we really want to get to the surgery itself.
So that you can record the responses of individual neurons as well as...
So right now she's going through the surgery to have the implementations.
And so in this case we implanted two. These are implanted along the motor strip and really tried to target this so that we would place one centered in the areas that were activated when she was imagining using her hand, and then place the second one in the area that was activated when she imagined using her shoulder. 2 days after surgery, we went over to the rehab hospital. We took the system with us so we could plug her in. And we were just curious to find out whether or not we could record anything that sounded like a neuron.
When we hooked her up for the first time and we had her think about moving her little finger, right then we knew we'd done everything really well and that we had a really good circumstance so that, you know, we could do good recordings and that Jan was going to work out really well. Now go ahead and try moving your wrist. There you go. There we go.
every day as we get closer, as we drive closer and then we come up the
So
road.
these are the electrodes that they
to
use
come
to
to the
plug
lab,
into the
I'm
machine,
thinking,
and the
oh
machine would
good,
be
what are we
controlled
gonna
to
do
that robotic
today?
arm.
What's gonna be new? And every time we do something new, it's challenging at first, and then when I get 28 out of 30 or whatever the score is, and they say that was all you, that wasn't the computer doing it, that was all you, I just can't stop smiling. It's so cool. I'm moving things. I have not moved things for about 10 years.
Yay.
All right.
There we go.
Very fast.
Initially, we started out with her doing three-dimensional control of the hand, and so she's controlling the endpoint position of the arm, moving forward, backward, up, down, left and right, that kind of thing. And so since she was making good progress with that, we decided to try to add in orientation of the wrist, so rotating it, in all three directions, and then also adding in grasp. So that's where we're sort of focusing now on 7-dimensional control of this endpoint position, orientation and grasp, and sort of really working on interacting with objects and being able to move them around her environment.
This counterclockwise.
I used to have to think up, clockwise, down, forward, back. Now I just look at the target and Hector goes there. It's not a matter of thinking which direction anymore. It's just I want to do that, and my brain knows what things to move to make that happen.
Right now, all Jan is doing is imagining moving the arm exactly where she wants the arm to go, just like you or I would control our own arm. What we've done, interestingly, with Jan is that normally the computer controls a little bit and Jan controls a little bit. At least that's how we started. And Jan didn't want to know when we switched the computer control off. She didn't want to know when we weren't assisting her in the task. And almost as soon as she said that, we flipped all the controls off, so we gave her complete control of the arm, and then she controlled it perfectly.
Yay!
That was incredible.
20 out of 20.
You made that look like training.
I'm performing the computer because it doesn't usually do more than 19.
There are things I regret not doing when I was able, not skydiving, but some adventures I would love to have had, and I regret not doing them now. And this is the ride of my life. I keep saying this is the roller coaster. This is the skydiving. It's just fabulous, and I'm enjoying every second of it.
From the beginning, we've been really focused on, how much control can you get of this arm, moving the hand and wrist and everything. But, Jan's goal has really been to feed herself a piece of chocolate.
There we go. Just took a little
One small nibble for a woman, one giant bite for DCI.
I think the highlights of the study are watching Jan feed herself, watching Jan move objects, watching her complete tests that we normally have for people with stroke who are trying to recover function, and having this beautiful fluid control of a robotic arm through thought.
I think it would be great to really get her to the point where she can actually feed enough food that she can satisfy herself and that it becomes routine. I guess I'm a little worried that she's eating just chocolate and cheese. We need to start to vary the diet a little bit.
Today I accomplished a goal that I set before the surgery even took place. They were asking if there was something special I wanted to do, like touch my children's cheek or hold my husband's hand, and I said, my goal is to feed myself chocolate. And I did that today. I fed myself chocolate, and then string cheese, and then a red pepper. So we're trying to get a balanced diet here.
Watch Jan smile after completing a task in a time that's close to what I could complete that task in, and you think, wow, how do we just have to take the next steps where we can make this a clinical tool, not a research one.
It overwhelms me. I'm so glad I did this, and I know some people will watch this down the road and say, you know what? I could do that. I can't hold a job anymore. I can't even talk to my children or pick up a pen to write. But I can do that, and I can make a difference for people in the future. So I'm excited to think that our work here in the lab will inspire more people to come forward and for the work to continue.
that's the story. They've had, and I really wanted to grab other videos too, because not only have they done this with hands, but they've also been able to do it with walking apparatuses. So you'll notice that when they do get them plugged into machines, there's this whole learning process, just like you saw Jane with the hand. It took quite some time for her to, as she said, as she stated herself, she had to think about the motions first. She had to think about moving the hand, turning it clockwise, moving it forward, and then eventually, after a while, she started to learn to just think about, not even thinking about the motion, just thinking about where she wanted to move that hand. And she said, eventually, it just started to do it on its own. So that process is just exactly what babies do when they first. If you ever watch babies when they're super young and they start to pick up items, they do exactly that. They start to stare at the object, they look at their hands, they move things, and eventually that, after a while, they get to learn how motion works. They can perform motor functions fairly easily. They don't think about having to pick something up, they just do it. That's the same thing that's happening with Jane. And they've been able to do it. This clip that I was talking about, they've been able to do it with assisted walking machines. So they have these people that are paralyzed, that lose the ability to walk, and they have them fitted with these machines. And from what I saw last time, they're fairly rudimentary. It's like a big machine with these two robot legs. And they do the same thing. They get them connected to the primary motor cortex, and they have that person learn to eventually be able to move. And obviously that's going to be more of a longer task, a longer arduous process, because there's a lot that is involved in motion. They learn how to be able to balance themselves and be able to mimic certain motions. And for the Super Bowl, one of the kickoffs, and I can't remember which one because I'm not really that into sports, but one of the kickoff for one of the Super Bowls, they had a guy kick the ball, and you saw him on this robotic machine. That robotic machine was exactly the same MMI interface that they had doing, and people weren't really all that aware of what that was. They just saw some dude with the robot legs that came up and kicked, but they didn't really understand the significance of it. It was a man that had absolutely no motor control of his legs, regaining that ability to be able to move himself.
I think it was the Super Bowl.
Was it? Was it? I haven't watched. I remember I don't really watch the Super Bowl. I probably watch commercials, and I know when that portion happens, I kind of tuned out. So I didn't really pick up on it. I've been wanting to find more of the clips of it. I just haven't gotten around to it. But nonetheless, what we're really trying to move towards is this. This is where we start to see a lot of military influence, a lot of military funding for this type of stuff. This is a project that was started in 2012, where they have a man in a cockpit, but there's no actual motor controls. And so they put him in this basically a simulator to see if he can move the fighter jet just simply by thinking about the motions. And without the need of a control or anything like that, what they're trying to move towards are just unmanned machines. You can get people that are connected to basically a terminal, just like a big video game. They just have them thinking about the motion, and then you get these fighter jets moving around. This was a fairly big project, but again, kind of a shut down project just because of the implications behind things like this. Because obviously, you're starting to bridge machine. I mean, obviously, fighter jets that are big, obviously very expensive weaponry connected to mines and stuff like that. So there's a lot of suppression with stuff like that. Kind of similar to what they're doing with AI. I know we've made some huge strides in artificial intelligence, and yet then they're saying, I don't know about artificial intelligence yet because we don't want these machines to think on their own. So with that, there's a lot that goes into it, but then again, a lot of questions about ethics of these types of studies. So that's it with our mind-machine interface. The next thing I want to get into is something a little bit more applicable. I don't know if any of us are really going to be doing any mind-machine interfacing stuff. If you ever do, that's really cool stuff. Let me know what you're doing with it. But let's get to something that we all love. Okay? And what I want to start talking about is the whole concept of sleep. And what we talked about in our last lecture, we talked about the reticular activating system. It's the RAS system. And you guys remember my story about the whole caffeine nap? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with consciousness, so the awakeness, what's happening is we get all this sensory information that travels to the reticular activating system. And that system is a series of brain structures that are all related to receiving sensory information, and it's all tied into wakefulness. And as we go through the course of the day, we get all these neurotransmitters that are blasted through the RAS system, and the receptors are constantly bombarded by these neurotransmitters. And eventually, over time, those things start to fatigue. The RAS system starts to fatigue, and that's where you start to get the feeling of tiredness. And that's where I mentioned in our caffeine nap that if you try and drink caffeine when those neurons have been constantly bombarded by neurotransmitter, it doesn't really do very much. And so that's when I talked about taking a nap, because then it'll reset the RAS system, and then you can start utilizing caffeine to stimulate those areas of the brain. Now, one of the things that we're going to learn later on is melatonin is a hormone that's secreted by the pineal gland. You might have heard of melatonin as one of the things that is involved in circadian rhythms, specifically related to sleep. You've probably seen derivatives of melatonin being sold at health stores to try and elicit sleep. But melatonin is specifically used to inhibit the RAS system and therefore trigger sleep. So one of the things that you're going to see when we do get into sleep is the different phases. I first want to talk about two different phases that are characterized during our electroencephalograph. The two types that we're going to be able to see are REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement, and the other being non-REM sleep. And this is what you'll be able to see later as our deep rest. And if you were to take a look at what happens during rapid eye movement, is dreams occur. Has anybody ever watched anybody sleep? I know it sounds kind of creepy, but if you ever watch anybody sleep, or even dogs, for instance, you watch them and you see eyes moving around quite a bit. You see a lot of muscle twitching going on. What's going on is there's a lot of dreaming. If anybody watches somebody sleep, you know they're dreaming fairly heavily. So there's a lot of activity going on mentally. So what you would expect to see are like beta waves, very similar to wakefulness. A lot of brain activity happening. So we would typically see something that looks like this, a lot of wakefulness. And what's happening in REM sleep, again, low amplitude, high frequency oscillations. We know that REM sleep is good for memory storing. Why do we need to dream? A lot of theories on dreams and things I won't really get into because that's more so in psychology, but memory storing. Learning is a big portion of it. And then mood regulation is also something important. So these are things that are fairly prominent, and I've always been really interested in learning more about dreams and what they really specifically mean, because sometimes dreams seem to trigger some distant memories or sometimes fears or anxieties. Sometimes, just how varied they are in nature. I don't know where they come from. I really wish I'd studied more about dreams, but nonetheless, here we are in physiology. Non-REM sleep, on the other hand, is very high amplitude. So again, these types of waves, high amplitude, low frequency waves. Again, these are more your theta waves. These are the deep sleep waves. And typically when you look at these, you'll see these long delta waves. And what you'll also find amongst these delta waves are what are called sleep spindles. And so these sleep spindles are these little bursts of high frequency amplitude. And what you would typically see with deep sleep, somebody not really moving much, but they'll have just at some point they might just twitch a little bit, and you can see it. And if you were to measure the EEG when these sleep spindles occur, they'll see a little twitch. So watch somebody in that first bit of sleep, and you watch them twitch, and they're in deep sleep. There's nothing you can do to wake them up. Have somebody in REM sleep; they might be dreaming. You just kind of wake them up a little bit, or you can just like touch them and they'll just wake up. Why? I'll show you in just a little bit. So these sleep spindles, people will just kind of jerk and that's it. And then they're back to this deep sleep. There's some theories behind it. You see children especially that have these little sleep bundles, or the sleep spindles. And it's theorized that it's all due to branching the neural connections from the primary motor cortex to those areas of the brain. We're trying to strengthen the synapses. Again, not a lot of foundation for that type of information, a lot of theories behind it, so I won't really get too much into it. Now, let's look at the different stages of sleep. And here you can see the stages of sleep from 0 to the 8 hours you're supposed to be getting. Okay? You can see the different sleep stages where we go from awake down to stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. And each of these 4 stages are characterized. Stage 1 is a light sleep. Stage 2 is more of the sleep spindles. Here you get to a little bit of a deeper sleep. Stage 3, you start to see a lot more of the delta waves, even deeper sleep. And then stage 4 are mostly our delta waves. And typically where you would see this would be the deepest stage of sleep. This is what non-REM sleep, someone who is not responsive. You can sit there, you can slap them awake, you can shout at them. I know in college I've had people, like, I remember somebody held a trumpet to my ear and tried to wake me up. I couldn't wake up. When I did wake up eventually, I did hear ringing for quite some time. But that is our deepest stage of sleep. And what I want to just show you is how we characterize those stages of sleep. What's happening throughout those 8 hours. And what you'll notice in the first hour is we go from awake down to that first stage of sleep. Okay? And what happens during that first stage of sleep? Does anybody want to like share what happens when you first fall asleep? We're like the weird things. What's that?
Easily awakened.
Really easily awakened. What's something else that happens when you sleep? Moody? Well, no, I mean you're actually like falling asleep, like that brink of falling asleep. Like you're like laying there in bed, and then you're just starting to like pass out. You get drowsy, okay. Yeah. Does anybody ever like twitch a little bit? You twitch, you have that feeling of falling. Those, yeah, you get those. Those are called hypnic myoclonia, and it's that feeling of falling. It's characteristic. And when I said that, everybody said, "Oh yeah, I get that feeling." Yeah, it's always something. It's either a dream where I'm like on a roller coaster and I'm going down, or sometimes it's a car crash and I'll just wake up and I'm like, "What the hell is that?" And then you'll fall back asleep.
I thought of that when you said sleep spindle.
Like the twitching?
Yeah, because I was like, that made me think of falling in my dream.
Yeah,
Is that big
that's
twitch.
that's deep sleep. This is actually within the first like second when you're actually sleeping.
So then is it a sleep spindle when you get that feeling in the middle of your sleep?
Quite possibly. What might be happening is you come right back to awake and then bring it back down to stage 1. This is typically happening if something like something interrupts your sleep. You're conscious, you're awake, and then you fall back asleep, and then you'll just kind of get that
Like
twitching.
an earthquake? Like an earthquake?
Well, an earthquake's an earthquake. That's a little bit different. That'll wake you up no matter what it is. But certainly, you can have like a dream of an earthquake and you just wake up immediately. And this is happening right when you fall asleep, and you might look at the clock and be like, I didn't even sleep yet. What happened? But typically and I want to take that back, because typically with hypnic myoclonia, you twitch, you fall back, and you open your eyes, and then you just fall back asleep again, in most cases. What's also interesting about this first stage of sleep, I don't know if any of you guys have ever like early love, like you call somebody, you talk to them late at night, and then you're like sitting there talking until the point that you fall asleep. This has happened maybe once on me. I'd wake up like in the middle of the night and be like, wasn't I talking to such and such? I don't remember that. So what happens right before somebody sleeps is that for the first couple minutes, like right at the point when you reach that point of unconsciousness, you actually have a tendency to kind of forget what happened right before. So you could be talking about something, you could be thinking about something, and then when you start to drift, you forget what exactly happened. This kind of explains the whole reason. How many people here snooze in the morning? How much time do you set your alarm to snooze?
Intervals of 5 minutes for like an hour.
5 minutes, 10 minutes? So for those that snooze for about 10, 15 minutes, okay, how many was it, 10 minutes? For you guys that snooze for about 10 minutes, do you know how many times your alarm has gone off? No? Okay, that's a few too. Generally speaking, people that for about 10 to 15 minutes, all right, it's a second alarm, I gotta get up. All right, that's a third alarm I gotta get up. If you set your snooze to about 3, 4, 5 minutes, you don't really remember that stuff. Because like I said, when you fall back asleep, you forget what happened a couple of minutes ago. So it's not uncommon when you look at any sort of like timers, clocks, you look at apps, they always set it to 10 minutes. Why don't they ever set it to 5 minutes? It's ineffective. So if you want to snooze for about 10 to 15 minutes. It's a lot more productive in ways. Until you keep snoozing to the point that you turn off your alarm and then you wake up at 9 o'clock. So that's something really interesting about bringing that bit up, and just kind of tie in that the whole thing I was talking about earlier when you're talking to someone late at night. I don't remember what I talked about like a couple minutes before. It's actually interesting because at that point when you know somebody's super sleepy, you might be able to get a little bit more information out of them because they won't remember it the next day. All right, so now we're venturing off. We're venturing from awake down to the first stage of sleep. And what you notice, take a look at where you spend the most time in deep sleep. And deep sleep being the deeper stage, stage 4. Out of this entire map of 8 hours, where do you see the spending most of your deep sleep in? I think around 8 hours. Around 8 hours, you're more towards the higher, deeper stages. Where do you see the deeper stages of sleep? Stage 4. Within the first hour, right? That first hour, you spend that most time. So watch somebody fall asleep and give them about 15 minutes. There's no chance of waking them up at that point. They're done. They're at deep sleep. They reach that fast portion of that deep sleep. And that deep sleep is fairly important because we're able to turn off our neurons at that point where you would suppress any movement of any kind. There's a lot that goes into about that deep sleep. But what you notice after coming back after that first hour, you'll note, okay, now we're starting to climb back up into the lesser stages of sleep. And then you hit these stages of REM sleep, where REM sleep, you notice REM, rapid eye movement, this is the area where you're dreaming, is very similar to a wakefulness. So you get these bursts of REM sleep, and then you go back into deeper sleep, and then not until the third hour you see the REM sleep. So, certainly, you hit different areas of REM sleep.
Is it better to wake up during REM sleep?
It's better to sleep all 8 hours. Is really
Yeah, but I mean, if you don't have a choice.
Which actually is a good question. On average, how many people here get less than 3 hours of sleep a night? No? Nobody? Okay, good. How many of you guys get under 5 hours? Really? You can sleep that well?
Sometimes.
Okay.
Sometimes.
Most of the time? All right, so how about 6 to 8 hours? Most everybody else. Okay, so that's everybody else. So one thing you might notice about sleep, take a look. I used to sleep about like 4 or 5 hours, and I was definitely a little crankier person. But nonetheless, if you were to take a look at where would you see somebody spending the most time in REM sleep? Is it the first half of sleep, or is it the second half?
The second half.
The second half. So it's better. You see the reason as to why when we start, especially you start, and I don't know if you sleep at, let's say, probably not 10 o'clock tonight, if you're not already asleep now. If you go to bed and you get to about the 6th hour of sleep, maybe about 4, 5, 6, 7 o'clock, whatever time you sleep at, that's when you get the most number of dreams happening, because the latter half of sleep, you spend more time in REM sleep. Okay? And the times that you would wake up, you're most likely to wake up towards that very end where you're already at REM sleep, and you wake up, you're like, oh, that was a crazy dream. You remember it. Okay? You might not remember your latter dreams that that were taking place in REM sleep. So it's crucial to see that people that really lack sleep, that sleep less than 5 hours per night, get comparatively less REM sleep. And what I mentioned about REM sleep, notice what I mentioned: memory storing, learning, mood regulation. What happens with people that are not getting enough sleep? They're moody, extremely moody. They forget things. For some reason, I don't remember that. Forgetfulness. And typically have difficulty kind of picking up, I won't say learning, but learn at a little bit slower rate. And that's due to that lack of sleep that's taking place. So it's imperative that people really get the 6 to 8 hours in order to get that. They have done these types of sleep where They would get people sleeping. They'd look at where these REM sleep segments are taking place, and they would have like a little shock to wake them up, and they would deprive them of REM sleep. And that's where they started to find functionally they were impaired. They had inability to recall memory. They had bad short-term memory. They mood extremely moody, and so forth. So these are, like I said, the different stages of sleep. You would see deep stage of sleep happening at the first 2 hours, REM sleep taking place at the very end. And I'll talk more about the implications of why we need REM sleep a little bit later on. So with that, let's take a look at, give me a second, let me take a look at where. Let me get to language and emotion and motivation, and then we'll take a break. Because ideally, I think we're almost, I would probably say about halfway through, and I want to get you guys out early today. All right, so language. So these areas of the brain are involved in language. And so we have two specific areas. Broca's area, which involves articulation of speech. This is the ability to speak, how clearly you can speak. And what you would notice about people that have damage to this area have difficulty speaking. They can't typically say things, and they're called aphasias. They mumble, they stutter a lot. Yes. What's that?
I was gonna say, oh, is that like stuttering?
Stuttering, yeah, exactly. It's just the inability to be actually speak. They know what they're trying to say, they just can't formulate the words to say what they want to say. It doesn't affect their ability to understand. So you can talk to that person, they understand exactly what they're saying, they just can't communicate it back. Wernicke's area is the other side of it. Wernicke's area is involving the comprehension of language. They can speak fine, right? But they can't really understand what you're trying to say. So speak to them, and they'll mutter off about something else, and it'll just be a string of nonsensical words. So people will typically, with Wernicke's area, they might just start speaking things that make no sense at all because they can't comprehend. They haven't been able to comprehend anything that people have been saying. They know the words, it just doesn't make sense of what they're saying. So these are the typical aphasias. So aphasias are things where you start to see damage in those areas. And I have very quick examples that I can show you of Broca's aphasia, where, again, able to understand the question, but not able to articulate it.
Now tell me what this thing was with your legs last week or week before.
No good.
Did you expect? Couldn't really say it. He knows exactly what he's trying to say.
And
So again, he doesn't say anything at all. Now let's take a look at Wernicke's aphasia. So this lady, the interviewer will ask her a question, but you'll see, she won't be able to, I won't spoil it, let me just get right into it.
Thanks. And say baseball player, okay. Caterpillar, cantaloupe. Okay. All right, I'd like for you to do some things now with your mouth. First thing I'd like for you to do is stick out your tongue. Stick your tongue? Great. Show me how you would.
You can see that she has some issues, obviously being able, nothing really wrong with her ability to speak, but really can't understand very well. And so typically you would see these aphasias as a result of damage to those areas of the brain, such as stroke, or any traumatic injury to that particular area. Another area is the angular gyrus, and this is actually in the parietal lobe, and this is all related to memory retrieval, so things that are responsible for the integration of auditory, visual, and somatosthetic information. This is memory, this is perception, and is related also to memory and taking numbers and being able to process them. the things that what they find about people that have damage to these areas is that you typically find dyslexia, so the inability to be able to see the patterns in words, inability to do math. You sometimes see issues with attention and so forth. What they've done before is the stimulation of these areas, and what they know is by stimulating that area, and literally like probing into that area and shocking that area, is if this is an area that's responsible for perception, people have found that they've had what are called like out-of-body experiences, something where they feel like they're, and I don't know if you've ever seen people that have like near-death experiences, and they feel that they've like stepped themselves away from their bodies and they can watch everything that's going on. So it's like this feeling of detachment from receiving sensory information. Last thing on here is the arcuate fasciculus, and this is basically all related to information traveling between the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. Basically, when you look at all of speech, the whole concept of language, it's not really just the ability to speak, but it's also the ability to comprehend things. So obviously you're going to have information traveling between these two areas. So a lot of these pathways that we mentioned way earlier, if I can get back to it. Way back. I don't know how far back I have to go. But it was way too far. Getting there. I'm like trying to skip that lobotomy video because I don't want to see it again. But these are going to be your association tracts and commissural tracts. Basically what you're doing is sending information back and forth to be able to communicate to each other. So you take in information, sensory information goes from one area and then travels as you're sitting there communicating and understanding the words that are coming out, and understanding the words and putting together the words that you need to speak will need to travel back and forth to different areas of the brain. And of course, if you're trying to speak, you get to the Broca's area, and then you're going to have to take that back over to the primary motor cortex, because those are the areas that are going to control the lips, the mouth, the tongue, to be able to speak and formulate the words. So going back to that last thing I was talking about, so those are areas that, as I mentioned, for speaking. The last thing I want to leave you before we go on break is emotion and motivation. So these areas, this is the limbic system. The limbic system, again, not a specific structure, but it's a whole collection of all these nuclei that are found in this whole ring around the midbrain. And these are all the different things that you would see. Hypothalamus, hippocampus, amygdala, the thalamus, which is receiving sensory information, the corpus callosum, which is sending information between the left and right hemispheres. And then, also notice on here, the olfactory bulb and olfactory tract. And olfactory is related to the sense of smell. So looking at the emotion and motivation, these are all things that are related to the states of emotion. It's all involved in these systems. One thing that it drives emotion, it's heavily tied into memory. So if you ever think about certain emotions that evoke certain things, certain situations that evoke memory, typically are tied into things that were emotional. What's also interesting, and then we'll learn this in our sensory lecture, is olfactory, which is our sense of smell. You'll learn that that sensory pathway leads directly into the limbic system. So if you ever to think about certain memories that you ever had, you would notice that the thing that you might remember the most vividly is the sense of smell. You remember in anatomy, if you were kind of averse to dissection, you remember the smell of formaldehyde. So if I were able to release, if I cracked a little bit of formaldehyde, you would sense it. You would think, oh, I'm thinking of dissection lab right now. And probably the emotion that's tied into it.
Even with like you smell like something that your mother cooked when you were
Certainly. There's a certain emotion that's tied to that. Maybe the certain perfume or cologne that somebody used to wear. You might smell it, you might think of that person. And it's actually fairly subconscious. Before you're even really consciously aware, that memory is certainly triggered. So these are all the things that you were sharing with me are things that are tied in. And you'll learn that the olfactory sense skips some of the pathways that we're going to be able to see in our sensory lecture. And it's all tied into that. So with that, let's take a 5 minute. You want to do a 5 minute break? 5, 10, 5?